Verdun and the Rurik dynasty, beginnings of modern nations. Charlemagne's son, Louis I, became the ruler of the empire following his death in 778 CE. He agreed with his father's focus on reforming the empire to align more with Christian values, earning him the name Louis the Pious. He developed a blueprint for Christianity to help shape the laws and culture of the people within the empire. For a period, he maintained the empire. However, the issues that had begun throughout his father's reign worsened. The situation was further exacerbated by additional problems of his own creation. His primary challenge was trying to decide upon a successor from his 4 sons. Like the Lombards, Louis divided his realm into sub-kingdoms so they were easier to govern, while also appeasing his heirs. Louis I initially had 3 sons, Pepin, Louis the German, and Lothair. When he had a 4th son, Charles, in 823 CE, with his second wife, some of his subjects used the birth to instigate dissension with the 3 older sons. His sons, some nobles, and Pope Gregory IV forced his abdication in 833 CE. But due to instability triggered by the infighting of the various factions, the people demanded Louis's reinstatement by 834 CE. When Louis's oldest son, Pepin, died in 838 CE, he divided his empire amongst his remaining 3 sons, as was customary with Frankish traditions. However, Charlemagne's decision to keep the empire united had proven to be a more stabilizing system, and once Louis was no longer a unifying factor, the squabbles that had marked his son's previous period as leaders were only further amplified. Shortly after Louis's death in June of 840 CE, his son's squabbles devolved into a fully fledged civil war. The war lasted for approximately 3 years, ending in 843 CE with the Treaty of Verdun. Under the treaty, Charles was designated as the ruler over the western region, an area that includes today's France. Lothair kept the middle region of the empire, today's Italy, and Louis the German took the eastern portion of the empire that eventually became Germany. The Treaty of Verdun's result ultimately influenced the shape of present-day Europe. The Franks and the Germanic tribes fought over the territories across most of the southern and middle regions of Europe, largely untouching the northern area. But the Varangian chieftain, Rurik, saw the potential of the largely ignored region, leading his people north into the current-day Ladoga Lake region in 862 CE. Little is known about Rurik because that history was not written, but it is believed that he and his 2 brothers formed the settlement of Holmgard within a few years of arriving in the region. This became the beginning of what would be known as the Rusis dynasty. Rurik died in 879 and was succeeded by Oleg, a relative. Under Oleg, the Rusis territory expanded south, and over the next century, the dynasty continued assimilating many of the surrounding tribes. These different cultural ideologies helped to catalyze and perpetuate divisions and fractures within the empire. However, the Rusis dynasty continued to grow over the years and eventually became what is modern-day Russia. Alfred the Great. Alfred the Great, King of Wessex, was the 5th son of King Ethelwulf of the West Saxons, born between 847 to 849 CE. He protected his kingdom from repeated invasions and reformed many established systems to be more efficient. His reign left an indelible mark on the island that would one day form one of the largest empires in the world, Great Britain. Alfred excelled at military strategy, and by 868 joined his brother, King Ethelred I, in assisting King Burgred of Mercia against the Danes, often called Vikings today. In 871, the Danes again attempted to expand their grasp over the region and attacked Wessex. Again, Alfred joined his brother, engaging in several battles against the Danish forces. When Ethelred died that same year, Alfred was the next in line for the throne, becoming king. Over these 25 years, Alfred engaged in off-and-on skirmishes with the Danes, suffering some defeats but mostly achieving victories. His penchant for fortifying his military position and building new encampments in strategic areas proved to be successful against the Danish invaders. Alfred also maintained a positive relationship with the rulers of Mercia and Wales, and when they required assistance, he provided both kingdoms with needed support. They, of course, reciprocated. Although Alfred was a very capable military leader, changes he made within the empire itself earned him the epithet the Great. One such endeavor was mandating that all free men have the opportunity to learn how to read. He recognized that if people understood their differences, they'd be far less likely to feud amongst themselves. Otto I. The death of Charlemagne resulted in Western Europe again being plunged into divided regions. However, his reign was not the only time when Western Europe was united. Otto I established an empire that was more sustainable, becoming known as the Holy Roman Empire. What Otto I established lasted for several hundred years, well into the early modern era. Otto was born in 912 CE, the second son of a Saxon duke. His father, King Henry the Fowler, having seen his son's ability to lead, appointed his son his successor. When Henry died in 936 CE, the Saxons approved the late king's choice, and Otto was elected as king that same year. Circa 950 CE, Otto expanded his reach into new territories. The first group he defeated were the Slavs, residing just east of his kingdom. Next, Otto turned his attention to the problematic region that would one day be France. The people to the west were constantly attacking Otto's borders because they believed that Lotharingia, now known as Lorraine, was historically their territory. In 951, Otto considered a campaign to conquer this territory, where the Roman Empire had begun. Adelaide, the widow of the nominal king of Italy, requested his assistance. He marched his men into northern Italy to take the lands that had once been a part of the Lombard kingdom. He successfully rescued, then married, the beleaguered widow, and the moniker of King of Italy was appended to his many titles. Otto knew that he needed to establish a succession that could maintain his empire and legacy after his death. In 961, he chose the son he had fathered with Adelaide to be his successor. In 972, instead of attempting to defeat the Byzantine Empire through battle, Otto strategically married his son to a princess of the Byzantine royal family, solidifying a more stable alliance that would help his son in retaining this position of power. Under Otto I's rule, the land experienced a second renaissance. Their cultures thrived, and architecture evolved into what became the signature look of the Middle Ages. Otto I died in 973 CE, but his legacy and influence lived on for several centuries. The reign of Venice. Venice rose to prominence during the first half of the Middle Ages and remained an important city well into the early modern era. During most of the reign of the Roman Empire, and immediately after the fall of Rome, the region of modern-day Venice was largely a community of fishermen and salt workers. Following the invasion of the Lombards in northern Italy, there was a migration of Italians south, and many settled in this region. For several centuries, the region passed back and forth between being controlled by the Byzantine Empire and whatever group was in control of the land that is now Italy. By the time of the Crusades, they had become a formidable power all their own. By 726 CE, Venice moved away from the Byzantine Empire and established a modicum of independence. To establish their own government, they elected their first doge, or duke, named Orso Epano. To end the perpetual swings of power involving the city, Doge Obelerio allied with the Franks. This alignment with the Franks forced the Byzantine Empire to agree to the Franco-Byzantine Treaty in 814. The treaty assured the duchy that they would have their own political and juridical independence. This guarantee was more than they had gotten from the empire, but it did not remove them from their control. Roughly 25 years later, the Doge had accumulated enough power to agree with outside powers without requiring consent or permission from the Byzantine Empire. This singular history helped to create a people who were less beholden to the Pope and more able to negotiate in their own interests. Venice eventually became a rival of Rome in terms of their power. The Vikings. Among the most infamous people of the early Middle Ages, the Vikings stand out as one of the most barbaric and mysterious. Besides being a dangerous enemy, the Vikings were curious explorers who did something that no one else in Europe achieved until the early modern age. They actually reached what would one day be known as North America. Surprisingly, they did not try to conquer or explore it. Their behavior toward the indigenous people of North America was a stark contrast from those of future European explorers. The legendary Danish fighters we now call the Vikings were unique compared to the groups of people around them. The leaders of the neighboring lands and kingdoms attacked each other largely over territory, trying to obtain more power by taking parts of continental Europe from each other. But the Vikings seemed more interested in pillaging than territorial conquest. They were notoriously seafaring people whose ferocity and curiosity took them far from home and well away from their homes in Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, where they originally lived. From the 8th to the 11th centuries, the Vikings attacked their neighbors and sailed across the Channel to what is now England, constantly raiding, plundering, and taking stolen goods back to their homes. The first known raid occurred in 793 on the island of Lindisfarne, off the northeastern coast of England. This was the location of a monastery, and the Vikings were as merciless toward this religious target as any other they would attack. They were among the few tribes that did not care about the sanctity of Christianity. Ordinary farmers and tradesmen, the Viking became fierce and prolific warriors. The Vikings did not record a written history, so historians are left to speculate on what drove them to attack the Lindisfarne monastery and other coastal areas. Among the most likely theories was a lack of food and resources, or perhaps inadequate access to farmland. The Vikings operated more like a well-organized group of bandits, yet they were definitely a robust military force. Their method of attacking was likened to more of a bolt of lightning than a long, protracted storm. However, their objective was only to plunder, rob, and then leave, never seeking to rule over the places they raided. Over time, the Vikings settled in some places that they had frequently raided. However, England was where their presence was the most influential. They were a perpetual problem for Alfred the Great, but they also knew the value of peace. There was a period of peace between the Danes who occupied the island and the native people, and the Vikings came to see that Alfred practiced many of the true teachings of Christianity. Over time, Alfred's military strength and wisdom as a ruler convinced the Danes to stop fighting, and they eventually became a part of English society. The second half of the Middle Ages. Christianity had spread across the Roman Empire by the time Rome was sacked by the Visigoths. The more popular the religion became, the more diverse the beliefs were about Jesus' teachings. There were several attempts to make a more unified form of Christianity, but despite those attempts, different sects were developed across Europe. While most of these sects were largely stamped out, the differences between Eastern and Western Christianity continued to grow. Eventually, the beliefs were so diverse that the powers in Rome and Constantinople could no longer overlook those differences. In 1053 CE, Pope Leo IX angered Patriarch Michael I Cerularius, the head of the Eastern Church, when he tried to claim leadership over the entire Christian world, including the Christians of the Byzantine Empire. To demonstrate his control, Leo IX gave the Eastern churches in southern Italy the choice to either conform to Western Christianity or be shut down. Patriarch Michael, whose religious power exceeded that of the Pope, was incensed by the Pope's actions, and in retaliation, he shut down all churches preaching Western Christianity in Constantinople. The widening gap between the two sides of the same religion became a chasm that has never been mended. Called the Great Schism, the event started by Pope Leo IX irrevocably divided Christianity into two religions, the Roman Catholic and the Greek Orthodox churches. Despite several attempts during the next century and a half to bring the two Christian religions back into singularity, the animosity between the two parties made it impossible for each religion to ever forgive the other side. Less than 50 years after the events that initiated the Great Schism, the First Crusade began. The two religions may have disliked each other, but they both loathed the Muslims more. Removing the Muslims from the Holy Land was something both the Roman Catholic and the Greek Orthodox churches agreed upon. For the Catholics, it was a chance to repent for their sins and gain recognition. For the Catholic Pope, it was a way to consolidate his power in Western Europe. For the Byzantine Empire, it was a way to take back lands taken from them during the Muslim expansion across the Near East and Northern Africa. Historians disagree on how many crusades occurred because they became a very regular event. For the First Crusades in 1095, nearly 200 years would pass before the final crusade. Over time, reasons for the crusades became less clear, and the crusaders less organized, and this void in conviction created opportunities for corruption. The worst instance of this corruption was the crusade carried out between 1202 and 1204. The Crusaders were to reclaim the Holy Land, but it was quickly repurposed by the Venetians. The Crusaders arrived in Venice hoping to make their way to Egypt, but the price that the Venetians demanded to take them across the Mediterranean was too steep. Seeing a chance to profit from the crusade, the Venetians agreed to take them where they wanted to go if the Crusaders would reclaim Zara Egypt for Venice. It is uncertain what precipitated the next chain of events, but the Venetians steered the Crusaders to Constantinople. The Crusaders, who were so impressed with the city, sacked the Byzantine capital, largely out of greed and a vindictive desire to harm the opposing Christian church. Instead of attacking Muslims, they were now literally attacking fellow Christians. Historical items lost during this Catholic attack on the Greek Orthodox Church are still mourned to this day. A more devastating war spanned over 100 years and included most of the European nations. Known as the 100 Years' War, it seemed the energy put into the Crusades was now being refocused to kill their fellow Christians instead. Questions of succession were again at the heart of the problem when Charles IV of France died without an heir or a named successor. Historians would call the intermittent fighting between 1337 and 1453 the 100 Years' War because of how long and ever-changing the war was. The constant war saw many changes in warfare. By the end of the 100 Years' War, knights, who had been essential during the Crusades, were now obsolete. Guns were introduced, entirely changing the tactics of war. The changes in weaponry required a significant change in strategies and military structures, as the formations and tactics used by the Romans no longer worked against evolving weaponry. Military structures came to rely on personnel who were trained to fight a standing war, instead of relying on peasants and people who knew little about combat. Outside the Crusades and wars, the Great Famine between 1315 and 1317 is still remembered across Europe for its devastating and long-lasting effects on the population. Part of the problem was that their agrarian system was based on meeting an outdated demand. Additional cultivation for food was not considered when the population of the continent was growing exponentially. During the first year of the Great Famine, there were few deaths through winter, but most people didn't have sufficient food. Malnourished by the following spring, they could not meet the demand for food. With fewer people and depleted manpower to tend the fields, there was another shortage of crops during the harvest, and many people died in 1360. The most devastating impact of the Middle Ages, however, was the bubonic plague. Known as the Black Death, historians estimate that between a quarter to half of the European population perished due to the plague. The bubonic plague is one of the worst disasters in European history. It caused such a deep scar on the European psyche that most people know of the event. The Renaissance. The Renaissance was a time when the European nations returned to the ideas and philosophies largely ignored during the Middle Ages. Without Rome to hold them together, the many lands were forced to find their own identities. Men like Charlemagne and Otto I unified many areas that had once been in the empire, but the full range of the Roman Empire was never again achieved, at least not from a governmental perspective. The only unifying factor for Western Europe during the Middle Ages was the Christian Church, which became the Roman Catholic Church after the Great Schism. The religious figureheads continually consolidated power under the guise of religion until they had more power than nearly any monarch in Europe. The Church was dubious of any attempt to query its position and increasingly stifled free thinking and science to maintain control over a less evolved continent. The Italian Renaissance was the beginning of a new era, dubbed the Early Modern Era. The leaders of the Renaissance typically did not directly challenge the Roman Catholic Church, but were firmly of the opinion that the Church should have no say over deciding the world's truths. As the Renaissance spread to the different nations in Europe, things changed. Between the end of the 14th century and 1620, Europe emerged from the Middle Ages with a new understanding of their world. Overcoming two obstacles of the Middle Ages enabled the path to the Enlightenment of the Renaissance. The first was creating new systems for planting and harvesting crops that made it easier to grow more food to feed more people, ultimately allowing people more free time. The second was introducing the means for mass literacy. In the mid-15th century, Johannes Gutenberg introduced the printing press. For the first time in history, it was possible to mass-produce reading material. The printing press made it much easier and cheaper to print books. Both innovations not only contributed to the Renaissance, but also augmented its occurrence. The Renaissance was a time of enlightenment where Europe returned to a golden era of thinking that occurred during the Roman Empire. Architecture reflected the designs of that classical period, such as the Palace of Versailles. Men explored mathematics and sciences, and people became energized and more inquisitive. The Renaissance was a short period of about only a century. By the start of the 17th century, the Protestant Reformation had sparked wars across Europe. But despite the return to fighting, the ideologies and types of thinking prevalent during the Middle Ages were largely gone. Societies changed, with serfdoms largely disappearing. The Renaissance gave way to the Enlightenment period, which saw significant advances in science, particularly physics, and inventions that changed the world came along with increasing frequency. The people of the Middle Ages turned to God to solve their problems. After the Renaissance, they increasingly turned to science and research to resolve them instead. People wanted to be more in control of their existence instead of relying on faith. And this enlightenment became possible because of the paradigm shifts in thinking that emerged from the Renaissance.